Well, now let's turn our focus to the big international story. Remember, tensions have erupted between China and Canada. In fact, tensions have escalated now with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau saying that everyone in China should be allowed to protest and express themselves. The Prime Minister has also added that Canadians were closely watching the protests against the country's zero-COVID policy. Trudeau's statement comes as the country's foreign minister claimed that Canada will not compromise values in relations with China. Both Justin Trudeau and Xi Jinping share a frosty relationship shaped by years of diplomatic tensions. Recently, in the G20 summit, Xi Jinping angrily rebuked Trudeau over so-called leaks to media about Canada-China relations. Now, clearly, things are stormy between the two countries. But before we go into an expert view on what exactly this is all about and how we put it into perspective, let's listen into what Justin Trudeau had to say.
Canadians are watching very closely. Obviously, everyone in China should be allowed to express themselves, should be allowed to share their perspectives and indeed protest. We're going to continue to ensure that China knows we'll stand up for human rights, we'll stand with people who are expressing themselves. We also need to make sure that China and places around the world are respecting journalists and their ability to do their job. We'll continue to make that very clear.
Right. To make sense of all these developments, I'm now joined here on the program by Dr. John Harrison from the Rabdan Academy in UAE. Good evening, Dr. John Harrison. Before I come to you, let me tell our viewers that Dr. Harrison is an internationally recognized expert in aviation security, in terrorism, and in political science. Dr. Harrison was also embedded with the U.S. Special Forces in Tikrit in Iraq in 2008. Very warm welcome to you, Dr. Harrison. Now, what we're trying to understand here is there's been a very vocal expression of disapproval by some of the world leaders, whether it is UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak or you have Justin Trudeau now, in some ways supporting the people's uprising in China and supporting the challenge that it poses to Xi Jinping, saying this is the kind of dissent that must be allowed. Why are these statements coming at a time like this, and how does it help the respective countries?
Well, Frida, part of what's going on here is that all the major countries, the US, the UK, Canada, the European Union, are all right now going through a very serious reevaluation of the overall relationship with China. Part of this is related to COVID, the issues with the supply chain disruptions and the realization that China has taken a much more powerful position in the world's economy, not just for consumer goods, but for a whole range of things that are now also considered very serious to national security, including computer chips and other things. So these nations are trying to figure out how do we disengage, if you can use that term, or re-engage differently with China. They're also looking at how Xi Jinping seems to now have almost unlimited power. He was able to change the constitution of the country, change the party rules to be able to remain in power. So it's become clear that whatever the relationship is going to be, there's going to be tensions now for long term. And all parties, the Chinese included, are going to have to sort of work through and figure out how this relationship that has fundamentally changed, how is it going to look? And can we rearrange this order or create a new order peacefully? And that's the most important challenge that the international community is facing. Can China raise and engage with the world peacefully? And unfortunately, that message is unclear.
Yes, that message is unclear because, there can always be an inference drawn from here, Dr. Harrison, if I'm not mistaken, that in a way you have these world leaders, at least those who have spoken out openly, some way pitching for the removal of Xi Jinping, you think?
I don't think it's going that far. I think certainly the United States has seen what the difficulties of regime change, peacefully and otherwise, can bring about. But what I think they want is perhaps clarity in what China's intentions are, and a little bit more for China, if it wants to be considered in a political sense and in an international sense, the leader that it seeks to be, that it has to engage in the international community differently. It has to be a much more progressive player. I don't want to use the term politically in that sense, but it has to engage in the world differently than it has been over the last decade.
So in a way, are you saying that the fact that this dissent is coming from within is something that has encouraged the leaders who do not approve of the Chinese policies or the Chinese way of dealing with the geopolitics? In a way, are you saying that the fact that there is internal dissent against Xi Jinping is helping their cause to corner Xi Jinping further?
It certainly is doing that, but I think what it also is helping is that many of the countries in Europe and North America, the European Union, the Brits, and the US, all have slightly different positions on how to deal with China. What this is doing is bringing those positions more in line with each other. There can be a consensus on that the people themselves do not like the decisions that the Chinese government has taken and the Communist Party has taken in how it relates to COVID, how it relates to what's going on along the last few years in Xinjiang province and with Taiwan and a number of other things. So I think these issues are helping to clarify, and it gives a number of countries the ability to rally around this particular issue. There is a human rights question. There is a protest question. Whether it's political or not, at very least, it's dealing with people's reaction to COVID, which for many in the West has been seen as simply a science issue and not a political issue.
Yes, but would you also say, that the relations, the China-UK relations or China-Canada relations for that matter, are the stakes low at this stage for the leaders to come out and express, this kind of a statement against Xi Jinping?
Not at all. I mean, we're into an area that I don't want to overstate it, but there are a number of very challenging issues that can boil over into a conflict. It doesn't appear that anybody wants that, but as we've seen recently in the world, that sometimes it doesn't matter what the international community wants. Bad things can happen, and conflict can happen. So I think what they're trying to do is send the message to China that you need to engage with the world in a way that the international community is comfortable with, and China is saying that it doesn't have to, that it can deal with the international community on its terms. And it can certainly deal with any situation internally on its own terms. And the Communist Party has certainly shown throughout its history that it is very comfortable with using the full coercive power of the state to be able to bring its population into line with whatever the party's position is.
Yes. You're an international affairs expert, and I must ask you that, the fact that you have the UK, the Canada, and the United States, of course, are aligned when it comes to China in a way, echoing each other's sentiments. Where does that leave India in this overall context?
Well, India has developed a very unique position in the world in this last year or so. And I think India will have to try to make a decision on to sort of how it sees its position vis-a-vis the conflict in Ukraine, but also now any sort of tensions with China. Certainly, India has in recent years a very active border dispute with the Chinese, so there is that potential point of conflict. And India is trying to see if it can stick to its traditional path of being non-aligned, whatever that means in the modern world. But it's going to be difficult. And what's becoming, I think, clearer is the space for people to be trying to take a middle ground or trying to find a middle path through is becoming very increasingly narrow. And again, we don't want to overstate this, but as those options begin to narrow, tensions will continue to mount, and it will be nations will have to start to take clearer stands, India included.
Yes, Dr. John Harrison, appreciate your joining us here on the program with some very important perspectives. Thanks very much for your time.